What would a surrounded battalion do if the only hope came from an animal forgotten by war? How could a stray dog see a path that hundreds of trained soldiers couldn't find? In December 1944, deep in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, survival sometimes depended on the most unlikely beings. The 76th Infantry Battalion had been cut off for 3 days. The German counteroffensive hit them like an avalanche during the Battle of the Bulge, splitting their lines and leaving them isolated in a pocket of dense pines where snow fell without mercy. Captain Robert Hayes stood at the makeshift command post, nothing more than a cluster of foxholes covered with frozen canvas, watching his men deteriorate by the hour. Their faces were gray, hollowed by hunger and cold. The radio had taken shrapnel during the initial assault, leaving them deaf to headquarters and blind to any rescue plans. Supply drops hadn't come. Artillery fire echoed in the distance, but whether it was American or German, nobody could tell anymore. Hayes knew the numbers: 214 men when the attack started, now 163, and falling. Frostbite claimed toes and fingers. Ammunition ran low. Food had been reduced to half rations 2 days ago, then quarter rations yesterday. Today, there was almost nothing left. The medical tent, a glorified lean-to, overflowed with wounded who couldn't be evacuated. Morphine was gone. Bandages were torn bedsheets. Sergeant Bill Turner, the battalion's most experienced NCO, had stopped making optimistic speeches. That silence scared the men more than the German patrols that circled their perimeter like wolves around wounded prey. The forest itself felt hostile. Ancient oaks and pines stood like frozen sentinels, their branches weighted with ice that cracked and fell without warning. Visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards through the constant snowfall. Every shadow could be an enemy. Every sound might be the prelude to another assault. The men had tried breaking out twice. Both attempts ended in disaster. Machine gun nests they hadn't spotted, minefields hidden under fresh snow, mortar fire that seemed to know exactly where they'd move. 6 men died in the first attempt, 9 in the second. After that, Hayes forbade further breakout efforts until they had better intelligence. But intelligence required reconnaissance, and reconnaissance required sending men into those killing fields. It was an impossible equation. On the morning of the 4th day, something changed. Private Eddie Kowalski was on watch in the eastern foxhole, the one closest to the German lines, when he spotted movement. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but the movement was wrong, too low, too erratic. Through the falling snow emerged a dog. Not a military working dog with its vest and handler, but a mutt, ribs showing through matted fur, limping on 3 legs while the 4th hung useless. The animal paused at the edge of their defensive line, ears flat, eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from surviving too much. Kowalski didn't shoot. Something about the dog's expression stopped him, a mirror of what he saw in his own reflection when he managed to find still water. The animal approached slowly, cautiously, as if testing whether these soldiers would help or hurt. When it reached Kowalski's position, it collapsed. The private, against all regulations about preserving rations, pulled out a piece of hardtack he'd been saving and broke it into smaller chunks. The dog ate with desperate efficiency, never taking its eyes off him, ready to run at the first sign of threat. Word spread through the battalion within minutes. Men found excuses to pass by Kowalski's foxhole just to see the dog. In a world that had become nothing but death and cold, here was something alive that wasn't trying to kill them. Someone draped a spare blanket over the animal. Another soldier fashioned a splint for the injured leg using rifle cleaning rods and strips of canvas. They didn't have names for it yet. That would come later. But they had already adopted it. The dog seemed to sense this, settling into the foxhole as if it had always belonged there. Hayes initially dismissed it as harmless morale-boosting nonsense. If petting a stray dog kept his men from complete despair, so be it. But on the second day of the dog's presence, Lieutenant Marcus Webb reported something strange. The animal kept leaving their perimeter, always heading southeast, always returning within an hour. It would scratch at the foxhole entrance, whine softly, then trot off into the forest as if it had somewhere specific to go. Webb had followed it once, cautiously, rifle ready, expecting to find German positions. Instead, The dog led him to a section of forest so dense with deadfall and snow-covered undergrowth that no patrol had bothered checking it. The dog sniffed around what looked like a small hillside, pawed at the snow, then returned to camp as if its task was complete. Webb told Hayes, who dismissed it as animal behavior, probably a den or food cache. But the dog kept doing it. 3 times the second day, 4 times the third, always the same direction, always the same spot, and always with that same insistent behavior, as if trying to communicate something beyond its ability to speak. By the 4th evening, Turner convinced Hayes to let him investigate properly. They couldn't afford to ignore any possibility, no matter how absurd it seemed. Survival had stopped being about following doctrine and started being about grasping at any thread that might lead them out of this frozen hell. Turner took 2 men, both experienced scouts who knew how to move quietly, and followed the dog at dawn. The animal moved with purpose despite its injured leg, navigating through the forest with the confidence of something that had walked this path many times before. It led them through a natural depression that enemy patrols wouldn't see, around a section where the snow depth suggested hidden dangers below, and finally to that same hillside Webb had mentioned. There, the dog began digging frantically at a specific point where snow had drifted against what looked like solid earth. Turner knelt beside it and brushed away snow with his gloved hands. His fingers hit something that wasn't dirt or rock. It was concrete. Old concrete, weathered and cracked, but unmistakably man-made. He dug faster, his men joining him, and within minutes, they'd exposed what looked like a ventilation shaft or access point. The structure was ancient by war standards, probably from the First World War, maybe earlier. The Ardennes had seen conflicts for centuries, and the landscape was littered with forgotten fortifications. The dog sat back on its haunches and watched them work, tail wagging slowly, as if satisfied that these humans had finally understood. Turner stared at the animal, then at the concrete structure, then back at the dog. Something impossible had just happened. Something that would either save them all or become just another cruel joke in a war full of them. If this story touched you, or if you're curious to see what Scout, as the men would soon name him, discovers in those forgotten tunnels, consider subscribing to follow the rest of their journey. Leave a comment with your thoughts, hit that like button, and share this with someone who appreciates stories of survival against impossible odds. The next chapters will show you exactly what lay beneath that frozen hillside, and why Scout's discovery would change everything for the 76th Infantry Battalion. Turner didn't report the discovery immediately. Years of combat had taught him that hope was dangerous when it turned out to be false, and false hope could shatter morale faster than any German offensive. Instead, he spent the next 2 hours with his scouts carefully excavating around the concrete structure, working in shifts to avoid drawing attention from enemy patrols. What they uncovered made his heart race, despite the freezing temperature that turned every breath into white vapor. The ventilation shaft led down into what appeared to be part of an extensive bunker system, likely built during the Great War when these forests had seen equally brutal fighting. The concrete was French construction, judging by the markings barely visible under decades of weathering. Someone had sealed the entrance with rubble and dirt, probably during the interwar years when such fortifications were considered obsolete. But the seal wasn't perfect. Time and weather had created gaps, and the dog had somehow sensed the hollow space beneath. Turner descended first, using a rope they'd fashioned from parachute cord. The shaft dropped about 12 feet before opening into a narrow corridor. His flashlight, one of only 3 still working in the entire battalion, revealed walls streaked with moisture that had frozen into curtains of ice. The air smelled of earth and decay, but it was still air, which meant the ventilation system partially functioned. The corridor extended in both directions, disappearing into darkness that his weak beam couldn't penetrate. He spent 10 minutes exploring just the immediate area, moving carefully, testing each step for structural integrity. The bunker seemed stable despite its age, though sections of ceiling had collapsed and debris littered the floor. When he climbed back up, his face must have shown something promising because his scouts looked at him with the first glimmer of hope he'd seen in days. Turner ordered them to conceal the entrance carefully, making it look undisturbed. Then they returned to camp through the same careful route the dog had shown them. The animal trotted alongside as if proud of its contribution. occasionally looking up at Turner with what he could have sworn was expectation. Hayes listened to the report in the command post, surrounded by his remaining officers. Lieutenant Webb was there, along with Lieutenant James Crawford, who commanded what remained of Baker Company, and Captain David Pierce, the battalion supply officer, who currently had almost nothing to supply. Turner spread a hand-drawn map on the frozen ground and used a stick to indicate what he'd found. The bunker system appeared to run roughly east to west, potentially extending for several hundred yards. If it was part of the Maginot Line's outer defenses, or even older fortifications from 1914, it might connect to other positions, possibly even leading beyond the German encirclement. Pierce voiced what everyone was thinking. It could also lead nowhere, or straight into enemy positions, or collapse the moment we put weight on it. His pessimism wasn't unwarranted. They'd already lost too many men to desperate gambles. But Hayes studied the map, then looked at the dog that had settled near the entrance, and made a decision that would define the next 72 hours. "We explore it properly," Hayes said. "Small teams, careful reconnaissance, no assumptions. If it's viable, we use it. If not, we're no worse off than we are now." He paused, measuring his next words. "But we don't tell the men yet. Not until we know what we're dealing with. I won't raise hopes just to crush them." Turner volunteered to lead the exploration. He took 4 men, all experienced in underground fighting from the campaign through France, and descended into the bunker system at dawn the next day. The dog tried to follow, whining when they initially refused, until Turner relented and fashioned a harness to lower the animal down. Scout, as the men had started calling him, seemed completely at ease in the darkness, trotting ahead of the patrol as if he'd walked these corridors before. The exploration revealed both promise and peril. The bunker system was more extensive than Turner had hoped, running for nearly a quarter-mile in a winding path that roughly paralleled the German lines. Sections had collapsed completely, forcing them to backtrack and find alternative routes. Other areas were flooded with ice-cold water that rose to waist height, soaking their already inadequate clothing and forcing them to wade through in conditions that could trigger hypothermia within minutes. They found old ammunition stores, rusted weapons from the previous war, gas masks that crumbled at the touch, and in one chamber, the skeletal remains of soldiers who had died here 3 decades earlier, still wearing French uniforms that had mostly rotted away. But they also found something remarkable. In the eastern section, where the bunker system approached what should have been deep behind German lines, there was an exit, partially collapsed but potentially usable. Turner spent an hour carefully excavating just enough to see where it led. The exit opened into a ravine thick with vegetation, invisible from above, that extended north away from the German positions. If they could navigate through the bunker, emerge there, and use the ravine for cover, they might be able to circle around the encirclement entirely. Scout proved invaluable during the exploration. The dog seemed to have an instinct for danger, stopping abruptly before sections of floor that looked solid, but gave way under careful testing, revealing pits or weakened concrete. Twice the animal refused to proceed down corridors that Turner's engineers later determined were structurally unsound and likely to collapse. Whether it was smell, hearing, or some animal sense humans had lost, Scout navigated the darkness with confidence that grew with each successful warning. The patrol returned after 8 hours underground, exhausted, soaked, and half frozen, but carrying information that could change everything. Hayes assembled his officers immediately, and this time the discussion was different. They had a route. Dangerous, uncertain, requiring multiple trips to move the entire battalion through in small groups, but a route nonetheless. The question was whether they could execute it before the Germans tightened their grip or before the weather, which showed signs of worsening, made movement impossible. Webb raised the crucial concern. "We'll be exposed during the transitions, getting men down into that shaft, moving them through water-filled sections, bringing them up at the far end. Each group will be vulnerable. If the Germans discover what we're doing, they could trap us in there or hit us as we emerge." Hayes nodded grimly. "Which is why we do it at night. Small groups, staggered timing, complete noise discipline. We leave the wounded until last with a small guard force. Make it look like we're still holding position." He looked at Scout, who lay near the stove they'd fashioned from an ammunition can. "And we use every advantage we have, including the one we didn't expect. The decision to move through the bunkers turned the entire battalion into a silent, focused machine. For days they had drifted between numb routine and quiet despair. Now every action carried purpose. Hayes ordered preparations to begin at once, but everything had to look ordinary from the outside. German patrols watched for signs of withdrawal. Any sudden change in activity might invite an assault. They started by reorganizing equipment. Ammunition and medical supplies were consolidated into central caches that small teams could quickly distribute before entering the shaft. Anything non-essential was either buried or destroyed. Pierce grimly supervised the burning of what little remained of their paper records and extra gear, watching years of accumulated logistics vanish into smoke that blended with the gray winter sky. The men understood the symbolism. They weren't planning to stay. Word of the bunker spread quietly through the ranks despite Hayes's efforts to contain it. Soldiers had a way of sensing when something was different. They noticed the increased movement around Turner's sector, the way officers spoke more in low, urgent tones, the sudden appearance of ropes and improvised harnesses near what had once seemed an unremarkable patch of forest. Questions circulated in whispers. Was there a way out? Were they about to attempt another breakout? Nobody dared ask openly, scared that saying the hope aloud might somehow jinx it. Scout became the center of attention in a new way. The men who had first fed him now watched as he trotted between foxholes, occasionally disappearing toward the forest where the hidden shaft lay. Someone tied a strip of faded American flag around his neck like a collar. Another carved "Scout" into a piece of wood and fastened it there as a makeshift tag. In a world of serial numbers and unit designations, the dog was the only thing with a simple, human name that everyone shared without argument. That afternoon, Hayes walked the perimeter one last time. He checked every foxhole, every machine gun position, every stretch of barbed wire half buried under snow. The men stood a little straighter when he passed, not out of parade ground discipline, but because they could sense something momentous approaching. He offered a word here, a nod there, careful not to reveal their plan, but unable to completely hide the new tension in his shoulders. Inwardly, he wrestled with doubt. If the route failed, if the bunkers collapsed, if the Germans discovered them mid-movement, the 76th Infantry would cease to exist in a single night. As evening approached, the sky darkened faster than usual, heavy clouds promising more snow. That worked in their favor. The thicker the snowfall, the less chance of German observation. A light wind carried sound away from the enemy lines, but not so strong as to obscure orders, shouted in urgent whispers. Hayes called his officers together one final time in the cramped command post. A candle flickered in the middle of the table, its weak light making the lines on their faces appear deeper, older. "We move in 4 waves, Hayes said, tracing a path on Turner's hand-drawn map. "First wave, reconnaissance and engineers with Turner. They'll confirm structural stability and secure the far exit. Second wave, most of Able and Baker companies. Third wave, remaining riflemen and heavy weapons teams. Fourth wave, wounded, medics, and rear guard." He paused, letting the structure sink in. "Communication will be by runner only. No lights above ground, no radio chatter. Once a wave leaves this perimeter, they don't come back." Webb tapped the map near the ravine at the far end. "What if the Germans are closer than we think on this side? If they've shifted a patrol route, we might walk straight into them as we emerge." "Then we hold them there," Hayes replied. "Better to fight in open country with a chance to maneuver than be bombed and shelled in this pocket until nothing remains. But we'll use the terrain. That ravine is our shield. We move along its depths until we're far enough north to slip between their lines." Turner added the part Hayes didn't voice. "And if any of the sections we marked as unstable have shifted since we last checked, we halt the wave until engineers can shore them up. No rushing. One collapse could trap everyone behind." His gaze shifted to Scout, lying at the edge of the tent. "He leads again. He finds weaknesses before we feel them the hard way." The plan was set. The only thing left was to execute it before fear could uproot their fragile courage. At 2300 hours, under a sky that had turned from gray to coal black, the first wave assembled near the concealed shaft. Snow absorbed their footsteps and deadened their breathing. Faces were wrapped in scarves and balaclavas, helmets dusted white. Each man carried only what was essential: weapon, ammunition, canteen, a sliver of food, and whatever medical supplies could be spared. Turner went down first, as he had before. The rope creaked softly under his weight, then slackened as his boots touched the frozen floor below. He signaled with 2 tugs. One by one, the first wave followed, disappearing into the dark throat of the earth, as if the forest itself were swallowing them. Scout remained above until the last of the first wave descended, pacing in tight circles, then allowed Webb to lower him with the harness. As soon as his paws hit the concrete, the dog shook himself, ears pricking, and moved ahead with the confidence of an animal that had claimed this underworld as its own. Inside, breath steamed in the narrow corridor. Flashlights were used sparingly, beams pointed down at the floor, or flicked on only at junctions to confirm direction. The frigid air bit through wool and canvas, but at least the men were out of the wind. Every sound seemed magnified: the scrape of boots, the distant drip of melting ice, the faint clink of metal on stone. Some men muttered quick prayers under their breath. Others focused on counting steps, anything to avoid thinking about the tons of frozen earth and cracked concrete above them. The first major obstacle came sooner than Turner liked. A section of the corridor where water had seeped in had frozen into an uneven, glassy sheet stretching from wall to wall. Beneath it, they knew, lay a shallow depression, harmless in itself, but treacherous enough that one slip could send a man crashing into the person behind him. Dominoes of bodies knocking weapons loose and gear clattering. Sound like that would carry. Worse, someone could break an ankle or dislocate a knee, blocking the path for those still to come. They solved it with time they didn't really have. Engineers went forward, breaking the ice carefully with entrenching tools, creating footholds and scattering the shards along the sides. Men crossed one by one, hands on the shoulder of the man ahead, turning a hazardous stretch into a slow but manageable passage. Scout waited on the other side, tail flicking with visible impatience, occasionally glancing back as if urging them to hurry. Back at the original perimeter, Hayes watched the tree line for any sign that the enemy had noticed their withdrawal. A mortar shell whistled somewhere far to the west, followed by the dull crump of impact. Machine guns chattered briefly in the distance, then went silent again. So far, nothing aimed their way. The Germans still believed the 76th Infantry was pinned in its pocket, too broken to try anything daring. That illusion had to hold for a few more hours. When the runner returned from the shaft entrance to report that the first wave had cleared the initial sections and reached the midpoint, Hayes gave the order for the second wave to move. This one was larger, slower, more vulnerable. Men who had been in foxholes since the first day of the offensive now abandoned the fighting positions they'd carved into the frozen ground, stepping away with a reluctance that bordered on guilt. These holes had kept them alive through barrages and assaults. Leaving them felt like betrayal, like walking away from a comrade. Among them was Private Kowalski, the first to feed Scout. He paused at the lip of his foxhole, looking back at the depression in the earth where he had slept, shivered, and prayed. Then he felt a cold nose nudge his glove. Scout, having resurfaced briefly between waves, had found him in the dark. The dog's presence broke the spell. Kowalski exhaled, muttered a thanks he didn't fully understand, and followed the line toward the shaft. As the second wave began its descent, the margin for error shrank to almost nothing. German flares rose occasionally over their lines, casting stark white light across the forest, but none fell close enough to reveal the strange, ant-like stream of men vanishing into the earth. The night pressed on, and with every passing minute, more of the 76th slipped from the surface world into the silent frozen maze beneath the Ardennes. The third wave descended into darkness just past 100 hours, their movement synchronized with German artillery that erupted somewhere to the west. The thunderous barrage masked whatever small sounds they made above ground, and Hayes exploited the timing ruthlessly. Every man in this wave carried heavier equipment, machine gun components, mortar base plates, ammunition boxes that had been carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent clanking. These were the weapons that might save them if they encountered resistance at the exit point. Below, in the bunker system, The atmosphere had shifted from cautious optimism to grim determination. The flooded section that Turner had waded through during reconnaissance had worsened. Meltwater from above ground seeped through cracks in the ceiling, pooling in the depression until it rose to chest height on some men. The water was so cold it felt like knives stabbing through wet uniforms. Soldiers gasped involuntarily when they entered, their bodies shocked by the temperature drop. Medics watched helplessly, knowing hypothermia would claim anyone who stayed wet too long in these conditions. Scout refused to enter the water. The dog stood at the edge, whining softly, pacing back and forth as if searching for an alternative route. Turner watched the animal's behavior with growing concern. In previous explorations, Scout had only shown this level of agitation when something was genuinely wrong. He ordered the wave to halt while he investigated. Using his flashlight sparingly, he traced the walls where the flooding began. There, nearly invisible in the murky water, he spotted what Scout had somehow sensed: a section of floor that had buckled, creating a gap where the concrete had separated from the foundation. The water flowing through was eroding the support structure underneath. If enough men crossed at once, applying weight to already weakened concrete, the entire section might collapse into whatever void lay beneath. Turner made a decision that added precious minutes to their timeline, but might save lives. They would cross individually, hugging the left wall where the floor seemed more stable, with rope tied around each man's waist so he could be pulled back if the ground gave way. It turned a 5-minute crossing into nearly an hour of agonizing caution. Crawford, leading the third wave, watched each of his men make the crossing with mounting anxiety. Every second they remained underground increased the chance that something above would go wrong. The rear guard at the original perimeter couldn't hold forever if the Germans launched a serious probe. And if the enemy discovered the abandoned foxholes before the entire battalion escaped, they might rush forward to investigate, stumbling upon the shaft entrance and trapping everyone below. The mathematics of survival had become a race against discovery. When the last man of the third wave cleared the flooded section, Scout trotted ahead again as if satisfied that the humans had finally heeded his warning. The corridors beyond were drier, but increasingly unstable. Sections of ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving piles of rubble that had to be climbed over in the darkness. Sharp edges of broken concrete tore at uniforms and cut exposed skin. One soldier slipped, gashing his forehead on a jagged protrusion. Blood streamed down his face, black in the dim light, but he pressed forward silently, knowing that stopping would block the entire column. They reached the exit chamber where Turner's team had spent hours carefully excavating an escape route. The opening was narrow, barely wide enough for a man with full gear, and led upward through a natural chimney in the rock that emerged in the ravine beyond. Engineers had shored it up with whatever materials they could scavenge from the bunker, but it remained frighteningly fragile. One by one, men squeezed through, pulling themselves up using roots and improvised handholds, emerging into the ravine where scouts waited to guide them north. Above ground, the ravine was exactly as Turner had described, a natural trench carved by ancient water flows, its sides steep and thickly overgrown with frozen vegetation. The snow had drifted heavily here, creating natural concealment. German positions were close enough that the men could occasionally hear voices carried on the wind, speaking in a language most didn't understand, but all recognized. They moved in absolute silence, weapons at the ready, knowing that a single cough or stumble might bring machine gun fire down into this narrow passage. Scout emerged from the exit and immediately began moving north along the ravine, nose to the ground, occasionally pausing to test the air. Webb, commanding the surface element now, watched the dog with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Every military doctrine he'd ever studied said that successful operations depended on planning, training, and firepower. None mentioned the possibility that a stray mutt might become the key factor in saving an entire battalion. Yet here they were, following an animal through enemy-held territory because it seemed to know things they didn't. The fourth wave, the wounded and medics, presented the greatest challenge. These men couldn't move quickly or quietly. Stretcher cases had to be lowered through the shaft on ropes, a process that required multiple handlers and consumed time they didn't have. The most seriously wounded were given morphine when they had it, keeping them unconscious during the descent. Others bit down on leather straps to keep from crying out when their injuries were jostled. The medics moved with practiced efficiency, but their faces showed the strain of knowing that every delay increased danger for everyone. Hayes descended with the rear guard, the last officer to leave the surface perimeter. He took one final look at the pocket that had been their prison for nearly a week. The foxholes stood empty now, dark holes in the snow that would be discovered come daylight. Part of him felt like a coward for abandoning a defensive position, even though staying meant certain death or capture. But orders were to survive and rejoin friendly forces, and that's exactly what he intended to do. In the bunker, he caught up to the tail end of the fourth wave struggling through the flooded section. The water level had risen another 6 inches, fed by steady seepage that showed no signs of stopping. Hayes helped pull wounded soldiers across, feeling the cold seep through his gloves and into his bones. When the last stretcher case cleared the water, he looked back. The corridor behind them stood empty, a dark tunnel leading to a battlefield they were abandoning. Somewhere in that darkness, Scout waited at the next junction, ready to lead them through the final sections toward freedom or destruction. Dawn was less than 2 hours away when the final elements of the 76th Infantry emerged from the exit point. The ravine had become a staging area where exhausted men caught their breath and reorganized into combat formations. Officers moved quietly between groups, conducting hasty head counts and redistributing ammunition. The numbers were better than Hayes had dared hope. 158 men had made it through. 5 remained unaccounted for, lost somewhere in the darkness of the bunker, or delayed by injuries that slowed them beyond recovery. Scout sat near the exit, tongue lolling despite the cold, watching as the last stretcher cases were carefully maneuvered up the narrow passage. The dog's fur was matted with ice and mud, one ear torn from catching on sharp concrete, but he showed no signs of wanting rest. When Webb approached to check on the rear guard's progress, Scout stood and trotted several yards north along the ravine, then stopped and looked back with unmistakable expectation. The message was clear. They needed to keep moving. Turner consulted his compass and the crude map he'd sketched during reconnaissance. Their current position put them roughly a mile behind German lines, but the enemy's deployment was fluid in this sector. Patrols could be anywhere. The ravine offered concealment for perhaps another half-mile before it flattened into more open forest. After that, they would be exposed until they could reach American positions, assuming those positions hadn't shifted during the days of encirclement. The battalion moved in a long, staggered column with scouts 50 yards ahead and rear guards maintaining watch on their back trail. Every few hundred yards they paused to listen, straining to hear anything that might indicate enemy movement. The forest remained eerily quiet. Even the artillery had gone silent, as if the war itself held its breath. That silence was more unnerving than bombardment. It suggested something was about to change. Kowalski walked near the middle of the column, his rifle slung and his attention split between watching for threats and keeping track of Scout. The dog ranged ahead with the forward scouts, disappearing into the darkness for minutes at a time, before returning to ensure the main body was following. Each time Scout reappeared, Kowalski felt a small surge of relief he couldn't quite explain. The animal had become something more than a mascot or lucky charm. It represented the improbable possibility that they might actually survive. At 0430 hours, Scout suddenly stopped, ears forward, body rigid. The scouts immediately dropped to prone positions, weapons ready. The signal passed down the column in whispered urgency. Contact front. Hayes moved forward carefully, keeping low, until he could see what had frozen his point element. Through the pre-dawn gloom, perhaps 200 yards ahead, a German patrol was crossing their path, 6 or 7 soldiers visible, possibly more concealed by terrain. They moved with the casual confidence of men who believed they owned this ground. The Americans remained motionless. No one breathed harder than necessary. Weapons were already pointed, safeties off, fingers resting on trigger guards rather than triggers to avoid accidental discharge. If the Germans turned their direction, if one enemy soldier happened to glance the wrong way, the entire escape would collapse into a firefight that would draw every German unit in the area down on them. Hayes calculated odds in his head. They might win the initial engagement, but reinforcements would arrive before they could disengage. The wounded couldn't move fast enough to escape encirclement a second time. Scout lay flat against the snow between two scouts, completely still, as if he understood the stakes. Minutes stretched like hours as the German patrol completed their crossing and continued east, their voices fading into the distance. Only when the last sound disappeared did the Americans rise and continue north, moving faster now, knowing that dawn would strip away their remaining cover. The ravine ended where Turner's map predicted, opening into mixed forest where the trees grew farther apart and the undergrowth thinned. This was the most dangerous phase. They had to cross nearly 3 miles of contested ground before reaching what their last radio contact, days ago, had indicated as friendly positions. But those positions might have changed. The entire front was fluid during the Battle of the Bulge, with units retreating, advancing, or being overrun without warning. They might walk straight into another German position thinking it was American-held. Hayes made the decision to move in company-sized elements rather than as one large column. Smaller groups attracted less attention and could take different routes, reducing the chance that a single encounter would doom everyone. He assigned Crawford's depleted Baker Company to move along the eastern route, while Able Company under Webb took the western approach. The wounded and headquarters element would follow the central path with the heaviest security. If one group made contact, the others might slip through in the confusion. Scout remained with the headquarters element, perhaps sensing that Hayes made the important decisions, or simply because this group moved slowest and needed guidance most. The dog's limp had worsened after hours of continuous movement, but he refused to be carried, stubbornly maintaining his position at the front of the column. Occasionally, he would veer off to investigate something the humans couldn't perceive, then return with what could only be described as reassurance that the route remained clear. As gray light began filtering through the trees, they heard American artillery for the first time in a week. The distant thunder came from the north, meaning friendly forces were close enough to provide fire support to someone. That someone might be them if they could establish contact. Pierce, the supply officer who had spent days managing scarcity, now found himself managing hope. He moved among the men, quietly reminding them to maintain discipline, to resist the urge to rush forward recklessly, now that salvation seemed within reach. At 06:15 hours, with dawn fully breaking, the lead scout of the headquarters element spotted movement ahead. American movement. He could tell by the helmets, the equipment, the way they moved. He signaled frantically for Hayes to come forward. Through binoculars scavenged from a dead German officer during the initial fighting, Hayes confirmed what he saw. A defensive line, foxholes freshly dug, machine gun positions covering the approaches. Behind them, vehicles and command posts. They had reached American lines. The challenge was identifying themselves without getting shot. Nervous sentries had killed friendly forces before, especially units that appeared from unexpected directions. Hayes ordered white undershirts tied to rifle barrels and sent his radio man, whose equipment had remained uselessly silent for days, forward under a flag of truce. The man advanced slowly, calling out unit designation and password from days earlier, praying it was still valid. Rifles tracked his movement from the American positions, fingers on triggers, until an officer emerged and waved him forward. 20 minutes later, the entire headquarters element crossed into friendly lines. Men who had maintained iron discipline throughout the escape now sagged with relief, some sitting heavily in the snow, others embracing squad mates. Medics from the rear area medical company rushed forward to collect the wounded, genuinely surprised that any survivors had emerged from what they believed was a completely destroyed unit. Hayes reported to the sector commander, a colonel who looked equally shocked to see him alive, and began the process of accounting for his men and reporting their intelligence on German positions. Scout collapsed near a supply tent, finally allowing exhaustion to claim him. Soldiers from the rear unit stared at the filthy, injured dog that had somehow accompanied this ghost battalion out of encirclement. Someone brought water, another found scraps of food. A veterinary corpsman attached to a cavalry unit examined the torn ear and injured leg, administering what treatment he could. Through it all, Scout kept his eyes on the men of the 76th, as if his job wasn't quite finished until he saw them all safely through. The 76th Infantry Battalion spent 3 days in the rear area, recovering from exposure and injuries that would have killed them had they remained trapped another 48 hours. Medical reports documented severe frostbite cases, malnutrition bordering on starvation, and psychological trauma that would take months to process. Yet the survival rate astonished everyone. Of the 214 men who entered the encirclement, 158 walked out. In a battle where entire units were being overrun or obliterated, those numbers represented something close to a miracle. The story of their escape spread quickly through the division, then the Corps, then beyond. Intelligence officers interviewed Hayes and his staff repeatedly, mapping the bunker system and adding it to tactical databases. Engineers were dispatched to explore and document the entire network, discovering it was even more extensive than Turner's hasty reconnaissance had revealed. The fortifications dated to 1916 and had been used intermittently through both wars, a hidden infrastructure that had saved American lives 3 decades after French soldiers built it. But the detail that captured everyone's attention wasn't the tactical brilliance or the careful planning. It was Scout. Correspondents from Stars and Stripes arrived to photograph the dog that had led an entire battalion through enemy territory. The story was too perfect, too improbable not to share with a public desperate for good news from the grinding Battle of the Bulge. Photographers posed Scout with his benefactors, Kowalski feeding him rations, Turner kneeling beside him with a map, Hayes saluting while the dog sat at attention. The attention made Scout uncomfortable. He tolerated the cameras and the petting from strangers, but his focus remained on the men of the 76th. When they moved, he followed. When they rested, he settled nearby, always maintaining visual contact with at least one soldier from the battalion. The veterinary corpsman who treated his injuries recommended extended recovery, possibly even evacuation to a rear area facility. But Scout made it clear he wasn't leaving. The 76th had become his pack, and nothing short of death would separate him from them. 3 weeks after their escape, the battalion was declared combat ready and returned to the line. The Ardennes offensive had stalled, but fighting remained brutal as American forces pushed back against the German salient. Scout went with them, officially designated as the battalion mascot with paperwork hastily filed to make it legal. He wore a modified service vest and traveled in the command vehicle when roads permitted, but during actual operations, he stayed with the infantry, moving through snow and shell craters as if he'd been trained for it since birth. His legend grew with each engagement. During an attack on a fortified village, Scout detected a hidden machine gun position that would have devastated the assault. In a nighttime defensive action, his warning bark alerted sentries to an infiltration attempt seconds before German combat engineers reached their wire. Some men began to believe the dog was supernatural, blessed by forces beyond understanding. Others insisted he was simply a remarkably intelligent animal that had learned to read terrain and danger through hard experience. Hayes didn't care which explanation was true. Scout kept his men alive, and that was enough. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The 76th Infantry, reduced and rebuilt several times over, was present when the final German units surrendered. Scout survived the entire campaign without serious injury beyond that first torn ear, defying odds that killed thousands of soldiers around him. When the division prepared to return stateside, the question arose, what happens to Scout? Regulations regarding animals were clear. Military working dogs had procedures, but strays adopted in the field existed in a bureaucratic gray area. Some suggested leaving him in Europe, finding him a home with a local family. The suggestion was met with such fierce resistance from the enlisted men that officers quickly abandoned it. Scout had earned his place among them through actions that no regulation could properly evaluate. He was going home with the 76th Infantry. Paperwork be damned. Kowalski, the private who first fed the starving animal in that frozen foxhole, filed adoption papers the day they docked in New York. Scout became officially his, though in truth, the dog belonged to everyone who had followed him through those dark bunkers beneath the Ardennes. Veteran reunions over the following decades always featured Scout's descendants. Kowalski bred him once before. Age made it impossible, ensuring the bloodline continued. At each reunion, Men now gray and stooped would tell younger generations about the winter of 1944, about being trapped and hopeless, and about an unlikely savior that walked on four legs. Hayes, who retired as a colonel, kept a photograph on his desk until his death in 1989. It showed scouts sitting in the snow outside that hidden bunker entrance, looking directly at the camera with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. Beneath it, Hayes had written a single sentence that summarized what they all felt. Sometimes salvation comes from the places we least expect to find it. The bunker system that saved the 76th was eventually sealed by French authorities in the 1960s, deemed too unstable for preservation. But veterans who survived that ordeal occasionally returned to the forest, walking the ground where they had emerged from darkness into dawn. They would stand in the ravine, now overgrown and peaceful, and remember the impossible journey. And they would think of Scout, the stray dog that saw a path when trained soldiers saw only death, and led them home. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that hope can appear in unexpected forms during our darkest hours, consider sharing it with others who might need that reminder. Subscribe to continue exploring stories of courage and survival that deserve to be remembered. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who appreciates tales of loyalty that transcend species and circumstance. History is filled with extraordinary moments. This was one of them.